Welcome to Professional Editors Podcast, episode 101. This is Dave Arney, and I'm joined by Karen Conlon. Karen, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. Thanks for asking.
Well, we were sort of looking for questions from the writers discussion group to, answer and be a little bit more involved with our readership, or in this case, our listenership. And one of the things that came out of there was a question regarding gender neutral pronouns and just the idea of sort of non-gender specific language. And there was two recent articles that came out, one of which was from NPR and referred to some craziness going on the East Coast. But actually, there was another article that comes out of Sweden that I found a little bit more interesting. And that was that, like us, they lack a neuter gender to their language, coming from the Germanic roots and instead of the Romance roots, the Latin roots. And so they've actually been inserting a non-gender specific pronoun into their language. And it's caused a little bit of a stir, but I kind of applaud them for it. And you were telling me, though, that you've sort of come full circle on this issue. So can you give us just a brief overview of how gender neutral worked and now works in English?
Well, now I don't know all the history, and I will say that right up front. But I know that we don't have a gender neutral third person singular that is not a thing. It
Right.
doesn't work for people.
We have it. Yeah,
It just doesn't. We have it.
That's not a
But
person.
it doesn't work for people.
And now historically, it was basically decided that you would just use the male person when gender was not known. You would simply say he.
Right. You would default to he, and well, that works, but for a number of people, they feel that it's too exclusionary.
Now, I was taught in college, that to be gender inclusive, this was, started the 2000s when gender inclusivity sort of came into academia with full force, that I had two options. One was to simply alternate he examples, she examples.
Yes.
The side note to that is you could always just use she examples and sort of rebel against the
and
old
rebel
school.
Completely. Yes. Yes.
And then there was the one that I cringed. I cringed when I heard it, but was to use they as a singular form. Did you have the same sort of cringing experience when that started to get used?
I used to have that cringing experience. I actually pulled it up here so I could reference it. In August of last year, I did a blog post at Grammargeddon, and my title was "Everyone Can Decide for Themselves," because I figured I'm going to put it right out there and let people start twitching the minute they pull it up. Because I used to rebel against this singular they until someone pointed out to me, and it's actually a word nerd friend of mine from elsewhere, pointed out to me something that I had totally forgotten, which was that if you're up in arms over the singular they, but you're okay about the singular you, you're actually being pretty grammatically hypocritical.
Well, tell me about that. What do you mean by the singular you?
I will read from my entry because I can do it better that way than trying to do it from memory.
Alrighty.
Once upon a time, long, long ago, but not in a galaxy far, far away, ye, which is now you, was the plural second person pronoun, and thou, which is mostly extinct except historical and fantasy writing, was the second person singular. Over time, the latter fell into disuse, and the former became the acceptable catch-all second person singular and plural pronoun. So we don't use thou and thee anymore. We use you.
Which is actually an interesting side note on translation. A lot of translators, specifically with Bible translators, have a hard time translating the ancient languages into modern usage because of the lack of the distinction between the third person plural, or sorry, the second person plural and second person singular. So that's
I'll refer people a lot of times. I will refer people to the King James Bible. Read the King James, and you can figure out whether somebody is talking to one person or a bunch of people.
And oftentimes it changes the meaning And so, in the interest, if like you, I think you're saying, if we're going to be in the interest of conveying the most meaning possible, we can't pretend to drop words and then not notice their absence. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, that's mostly it. I went on to say that and that my readers, I love my readers, is how we how we wound up needing phrases like all of you and dialectical constructs like youans and all y'all, because y'all is singular,
Mm-hmm.
Pitching a fit over a singular they, but accepting singular you without question causes some people to react very badly indeed. Of course, we're still in the very midst of the shift for the singular they, while most of us were raised with the singular you.
And
Unless, and I found this tidbit, and so I included it,
mhm.
unless we lived in Yorkshire in the 1940s, for example, when the, T-H-A, was the dialectical form of thou used in everyday speech.
Very interesting. And this sort
I
of
thought that was fascinating.
loops back around to the NPR article, which is actually looking at a usage of the second person to kind of morph into a third person, possibly gender neutral construction. But I think both of us were seeing that there's actually a much larger issue going on in all of this, and you just brought it up very clearly. Is what you're born with, what you are born
Mm-hmm.
hearing, is what seems correct to you, and why in some ways, and I'm going to say this and annoy people, there is no correct grammar. It is completely variant on a host of factors. And so let's kind of, I'm going to lay that thought out a little bit more clearly, and then
Okay.
we can pick it apart. But
Okay.
I know that you're reading the what is it, the language,
The language instinct.
the language
Yes.
instinct right now.
Steven Pinker's The Language Instinct, How the Mind Creates Language. And I am learning stuff on every page. It's blowing my mind. It really is. It's making me, I told you last week, David, it's making me reevaluate my existence. Not as a human being, but as what I do for a living. I'm an editor. I'm a copy editor. I have cut my teeth on grammar and usage and mechanics. And this book is setting me back on my heels.
Well, it brings us to a really interesting point. And for anyone who hasn't actually looked into linguistics and to the actual definition of grammar that I'm going to throw out here right now, this is going to seem very weird to you, but grammar is a descriptive, somewhat science, somewhat art that looks at how language is used. And not only is grammar in some ways universal at a very high level, but it's actually extremely personal at the lowest levels. It changes and evolves as the people who use the language change and evolve. So grammar is actually not a set of rules, but it's a descriptive, sometimes science of how words are used and used to convey meaning and what that meaning of conveyance is. Is that sort of what you're taking away from Stephen's work?
I believe so. Yes, I believe that says it. Um, Here, he on page 78, this is in chapter 4,
Mm-hmm.
he says a grammar specifies how words may combine to express meanings. That specification is independent of the particular meanings we typically convey or expect others to convey to us. Thus, we all sense that some strings of words that can be given common sense interpretations do not conform to the grammatical code of English.
And of course,
And then he
that
goes into that list that I read to you off
right, yeah.
air of, here's things that are ungrammatical, and we know they're ungrammatical, but hmm, you know.
There is this really interesting sort of confluence of some very basic things that all languages seem to share, which is a verb and some sort of object subject relationship to that verb. And
Uh-huh.
then, of course, there are things that we call grammar that actually have nothing to do with that sort of universal language instinct that he's describing.
Uh-huh.
So that sort of leads us into a brave new world in some ways when we really stop to consider what's going on, and that is that there is a grammar, but it's an intuitive, it's an instinctual grammar, and
Mm-hmm.
like the singulars and the plurals and the gender neutral ideas, it depends on where you were raised, what languages they spoke, what dialect of that language they spoke, then and the attunement of your ear. So, for instance, my father actually has audio loss at certain frequencies. So he does not hear language the same way that the rest of us hear language.
Okay.
And so his understanding of grammar is directly impacted by that. And some of the things that
Sure.
are normal to others are not normal to him. But yeah, there's a level of sort of language instinct and language commonality that does change. It does change with time. And then above that, we get into two other levels, and those are the levels that we often sort of find ourselves arguing about. And those are the levels of style and then aesthetic. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
obviously you and I sort of live at style. And I found an interesting sort of lead into this question, which was how has something like the Chicago Manual of Style changed over the years?
Mm-hmm.
And it's directly related to the idea that there is no actual grammar rules, but grammar description. Chicago Manual of Style, unlike AP or the APA, is directly linked to publishing and publishers. And so its constructions, its guidelines, things that we would commonly try to refer to as rules, are actually based on the nature of printing and the nature of being clear in printing. And as that evolved over time, so did the guidelines and the rules for how things should be displayed. This is what you were raised with, right? You kind of got into Chicago Manual as your primary style guide. Is that right?
That was the one when I worked somewhere that had a style guide. That was the one they tended to use. Um, Oddly enough, even though I worked in the editorial field for 20 some years, not every business I worked for had a style guide that we could actually reference. It was just sort of, well, you took English in school, you know what the rules are, make it right. And that was okay to a point, but as you pointed out, it's got to do with appearing in print. And there would be times when what I was producing didn't match what the editor at the next desk was producing, and we were working on the same series, and they really should look the same if they're the same series. The title pages should match, and the presentation here should match, and this wording should probably be the same because we're referencing the same stuff. And that's why you need a style guide. And because it's a guide, it tells you, in this situation, here's what you should be doing. It isn't teaching you subject, verb, direct, object. That's a whole different animal.
And of course, that gets us down closer to what we, are in this conversation calling grammar. But even
Right.
in that case, as we have shown that in English and in English over even the last 200 years, that has drastically changed. Of course, I always point out contractions because they're probably one of the most ubiquitous changes that has happened to the English language, and almost a complete reversal. But the point was that there were people using contractions long before they became acceptable to use, and it was only in some ways the bastions of correct usage that held on tightly to the idea that
Mm-hmm.
contractions are not real words and can't be used. Um, and so there's this third aspect that we kind of run into that is even different than sort of style, and in some ways contractions and other things, depending on audience, should be changed. Would you agree with that? We should probably still keep contractions out of academic writing or formal
Oh,
writing.
yeah. Oh, absolutely. And anybody who's paid any attention to what I've written at the writers discussion group at WDG will probably know that that's one of the things I always harp on. Let the writing fit the audience. If you're writing a reference paper, a research paper for your PhD, your language construction, your grammar, your style, your usage, and even your mechanics are going to be different from the essay that you dash off to put on your personal blog page. It's not the same audience, it's not the same purpose. Each audience, each purpose, each sometimes subject matter is going to tell you, how strict you need to be, how formal or informal, or are you going to use the vernacular, or are you going to use something more academic? It's fluid. It has to be fluid. We have to be able to reach our audience in the way the audience is used to being reached.
And I think that sort of that leads me into my big complaint, I guess I could say. And actually, I was having a really great conversation with Dima in the writers discussion group in our post about, what kind of questions should we answer on today's show.
Yes. Yes, I saw
And
that.
there is now this third level, and I'm not going to blame it on self-publishing, but there is sort of a new movement where aesthetics are being mistaken for things like style and things like grammar. And in some ways, aesthetics are completely personal and have almost the lowest, ranking. And I'm gonna call some things out here, and I'm sure that people will disagree with me. But the death to adjectives or adverbs, depending on which area you're in, is
Drives me
is an
crazy.
aesthetic choice.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
It's not a rule. It in some ways, okay, it may be driven by market demands. And if you want to get published by a publisher and they say don't use adverbs, well, don't use adverbs if you want to get published by them. But that's not even a style. It's not even a house style issue. That really is an aesthetic issue. There is nothing wrong. There's nothing ungrammatical, and there is nothing ugly about an adverb. But in some ways, we've sort of decided in this groupthink that these aesthetic options, these aesthetic rules, are somehow universally applicable and signs of good or bad writing. And that sort of really starts to grate on me, because I come from a linguistic background. I've done translation. I've done study of many ancient languages, and all of these things, as you said, are so fluid. For someone to accuse another writer of bad writing because they misuse an aesthetic, wow. Wow. I don't know exactly how to respond to that other than what?
Yeah. Yeah. There isn't much I could say either, except what? And it might even be spelled W-U-T in the vernacular. What?
Huh?
Yeah, huh? It boggles my mind. I can't imagine writing without using descriptors. I just can't.
It gets even more dangerous, because not only do adverbs have a function to themselves, and just like a passive construction has a function to itself. I've told you this, and I'll state it on air. Cars do not hit people. Drivers navigate cars into objects, but people are hit by cars.
By cars, yes.
They are not actors, and a passive construction is really the only, in my mind, proper way to talk about an inanimate object that has some sort of forcible action upon something else. I don't agree with the anthropomorphization of active construction. So, there's that. But even more dangerous is that we are losing, and this is what Dima's point was, we are losing things like the past perfect or the pluperfect, depending on which area.
Depending on when you grew
up,
yeah.
We are losing distinctions.
We found that out.
There is actually, and I can tell you this as a translator, there is a very specific usage for something that happened in the past and has no continuing effects versus something that happened in the past and has continuing effects.
Yes,
and it
absolutely.
might look unwieldy, it might be aesthetically unpleasing to certain people, but the meaning, and if that's what we're after, the meaning is important, different, and therefore needs to be clearly stated.
Yeah, that meaning is so important. And even not worrying about tenses, but just the difference between, this was one that came up a couple of weeks ago, the difference between continual and continuous.
Mm-hmm.
The reason we have those two words is they don't mean the same thing. And if it's a continuous occurrence, it never, ever, ever stops. They had sex continuously for 8 hours. Oh my God, somebody please make them stop. If it was continual, it was mostly going on all that time, but they took a break to go to the bathroom, or they took a break to go have coffee, or they answered the phone. But there's a difference. And it's the same thing with tenses. We have all those tenses for a reason, and not just for fun, and not just to make children agonize over whether they need this verb or that verb. Because, as you pointed out, the thing that happened in the past and has a continuing effect versus the thing that happened in the past and it's done. It happened, and now you don't have to think about it anymore.
So, I mean, I'm I'm reticent. I obviously I'm not trying to make rules. I'm not trying to make rules that you must use words.
Right.
I mean, words evolve,
Right.
meanings evolve. All of these things change over time, and that's just the nature of language. But when the aesthetic level starts to try and manipulate the grammar level, which is not the way that it necessarily should work. The grammar level is over time, it's an evolution of the ability to speak it and the ability to write it in order to convey meaning. Whereas this sort of reverse process of making aesthetic choices that wipe out meaning,
Mm-hmm.
that's a dangerous prospect. Now, I mean,
Yeah, I agree.
someone will say, "Well, Dave, you just said that it's an evolutionary process, and if we all decide that aesthetics are more important than meaning, doesn't that mean that that's now the new grammar?" Well, yeah, I mean that is how language
Sadly,
works. Um,
sadly, that's what it means. Yeah,
but
you've just wiped out all these layers of meaning because you liked the aesthetics of it better.
but
Ah,
but it is incorrect to call those aesthetics grammar. That is what I'm gonna put my
I,
my
I would
hat
agree
on.
with that.
If you're going
I
to
would
if you're
agree with
going to
that.
make aesthetic choices of that nature, then call them aesthetic choices, own up to them, and don't pretend that it is somehow grammatically proper or grammatically correct or have anything to do with the natural progression of this very robust language that we seem to have developed over the 2,000 years that we've been sort of moving away from the Romance and into the Pseudo-Germanic that we have now.
Right. And I will also point out the other thing people have seen me say a lot. Damn those living languages anyway. If they would die, we'd be able to know what the rules were.
Right, we could
But
encapsulate
that's
them.
why we know Latin rules because it's dead. It's, those rules are fixed. They're not changing anymore. But the rules for English, God forbid, who knows what the rules are going to be in 10, 20, 50 years because they change all the time.
And that to me, that's the beauty of language. And if these aesthetic choices sort of take over and wipe out things, there will be a resurgence. That's the other thing that we've learned, is that as something like the singular you comes into meaning, other things pop out to take on the meaning, like all y'all.
Yeah,
There is
all
sort of
y'all.
a need to convey meaning, and humans are extremely good at conveying meaning. And when you take away one avenue, they go to another. And
Mm-hmm.
in some
Mm-hmm.
ways, meaning finds a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because we really don't have a choice. We have to be able to convey what we mean. And as you said, if one avenue's closed, we're going to find another one. Well, then we'll say it this way. And people will twitch for a while because we're saying it that way and it's different. But the point is, we have to be able to say it.
Yes, indeed. Well, Karen, thank you for joining me today. This is Dave
Thanks.
Arney and Karen Conlon with the Professional Editors Podcast. If you like to hear more, go ahead and click subscribe on whatever medium you're listening through. You can check us out on Google Plus at the Professional Editors page and leave us questions, and we will try and answer them. As you saw, we tried to cover a couple of different answers today. Some shows we may go on a little bit longer. Some shows we may try and to cover more questions. So we are very, very interested in hearing what you would like us to speak about. And if you ever want to come on the air, if you're an editor or a writer and you want to talk about something a little bit more in depth, just go ahead and contact either Karen or I. We're both available on Google Plus.